A very good morning to one and all present here. I am your host, Shweta, and we are live from International Center, Hall B. We have a lecture today on the cataract and infection control, a practical approach. Without any ado, let's just get started with the lecture. And our chairman for the day is Dr. Mahipal Sachdeva. Our moderator would be Dr. Namrata Sharma and Dr. Rajesh Sinha. Welcome, sir. Welcome, ma'am. Over to you, sir.
So thank you. I think the panelists have not and the chairpersons have not joined yet. So would you want us to start the talk in the interest of time?
Yes, ma'am. We have a lecture due again at 12.
Right. So welcome everyone. I think I'll, since I'm the first speaker, I'll set the ball rolling.
Ritika, I think I can introduce you.
Sure. Thank you.
So I think, or Shweta can introduce Dr. Ritika. I think she's an eminent corneal surgeon. Please, Shweta, if you have something, or I'll introduce her. So I think to start the session, we welcome Dr. Ritika, who's an eminent corneal surgeon and who's been practicing for a long time now, as I know her. Apart from being a wonderful woman, wonderful human being, she's a very competent surgeon and heads the Center for Sight hospital chain. And her vast experience in cataract will definitely help us learn more through this session. Over to you, Dr. Ritika.
Thank you, ma'am.
Sorry to interrupt, ma'am. We have a small disclaimer to be shown.
Yes.
Can we
Should
proceed with
stop
that?
share?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yeah. So sorry, ma'am.
No issues.
Over to you, ma'am. You can proceed.
Okay, thank you. So I'll be talking about complications in cataract surgery, but rather than keep a very exhaustive theoretical talk, I'll just be taking you over as many videos as my time would permit. Now, the most common complication and one most of us have encountered and we would want to deal with well is a posterior capsular rent. We know that once we have a PCR, we see a bright red reflex, an AC may deepen, the nucleus followability goes away, vitreous surfaces and may clog your phacoprobe. But what is it that we intend to achieve now? Our intention is to clean up the bag in terms of nucleus and cortex and not extend the PCR and have a place to put the IOL. And while doing so, prevent vitreous prolapse, vitreous hydration, and therefore, the consequent complications of CME, retinal detachment, and even infection. Do note that with every case of PCR that you have, you increase the risk of endophthalmitis by 4 to 5 times if not handled well. So these patients, of course, do require intracameral antibiotics. I know many of us have moved to intracameral antibiotics for all cases, but at least for complex cases with longer surgical time, they are an absolute must. Now, let's just go over a series of cases. You see here that this is the anterior capsulorhexis margin, which has torn and extended into a PCR. Now, what is being done right and wrong here? What is right is that you should not use coaxial, you should use bimanual. But you see here, this is a vitreous strand which is actually being trapped and pulled. This is wrong. When there is vitreous, a simple IA will not allow you to cut it. You can aspirate the cortex, but you must cut the vitreous. So dragging the vitreous like this would increase your risk of CME and retinal detachment. Now, this is right. You have come in with a vitrectomy cutter, but it should not be through the main incision. Ideally, because to make a snug fit, it should be through the side port. When you have it through the main incision, you are going to depressurize the anterior chamber and more vitreous may surface. However, this is a good vitrectomy being done by expert hands. The bimanual irrigation piece is being used to maintain the anterior chamber. You see, this is a different direction. And you see the cutter pointing upwards will go beyond the PC rupture 1 to 2 mm. And so you're pulling the vitreous back. Another thing that could have been used at this stage is the use of triamcinolone, but in expert eyes, visualization is easy. What is being done here is the aspiration of the cortex using the cutter. Do note that the cutter has a cut IA mode for the vitreous and the aspiration mode also, the irrigate the aspiration mode also for the cortex. Now you have here a capsule that is deficient, but you have opposite 3 clock hours that is enough to implant a stable IOL. A single piece IOL must not be implanted in this case, and a 3-piece IOL is being implanted. The incision is being increased because a 1.8 incision does not allow the injection of a 3-piece IOL. The tricky bit here is that you have to place it in the sulcus, and there is a vertical rip here right across 180 degrees opposite to the injection site. So you do have a risk of the haptic falling vertically downwards. To avoid this risk, you can either place the IOL over the iris or keep one end of the haptic dangling out from the incision, which is what is being done in this case. Because if one end is dangling out, you will not get a IOL to drop down through the large rip that we have in the posterior capsule. Now, it is important to note that you must have a good visualization, that you are ensuring that the haptics are placed above the rex's rim. If the pupil at this time is not dilated, do not even hesitate from putting hooks. And you must now dial in the haptic into the sulcus. If you put a single piece IOL in the sulcus, the thick haptics will rub across the iris, cause pigment dispersion, risk uveitis and glaucoma, and inflammation in the eye in the long run, leading to complications like CME and endothelial damage and glaucoma. So do note that a 3-piece IOL is the IOL of choice in all cases with PCR. This IOL will center well if there is no vitreous, but if there is vitreous, you will not see it center as well. And that is again a sign for you to go back and check on complete vitreous removal. So take home messages from this video. First, if you have a PCR, notice it, don't move out of the AC. You see here that when you are moving out of the AC, you must put in a viscoelastic. A viscodispersive is a good tamponade. If you depressurize the AC, more and more vitreous will come out. And vitreous herniation will increase. Second is triamcinolone unpreserved is a good adjunct because it gets adsorbed on the vitreous and will assist you in complete vitreous removal. The third is that good effective anterior vitrectomy will require stable ports. Don't go in through the main port. Have good snug side ports. Dissociate the irrigation and the cut. So this is, you can put an AC maintainer separately towards the iris plane, away from the PCR, and a cutter which goes in through the a little posterior from the cut and pulls back the vitreous. Now, something which has become very popular is the use of pars plana technique for managing rents. You see here, this is a traumatic cataract with an anterior and a posterior capsule rupture. The coaxial IA is being used to aspirate the cortical matter because it's soft, but we are not able to aspirate because it is admixed with vitreous. At this point, again, we don't want to be aspirating vitreous without cutting it. So this is not the right approach. Because there is a large AC and PC rip, the pars plana approach is being used for doing a vitrectomy. When you go in through the pars plana, this is, they call it bringing the vitreous back home. You're going in from a posterior location and pulling the vitreous back. So when you don't pull anything up front, you don't cause more vitreous to herniate. And this is a safe way of reducing the expansion of a rip in the PC that is already there. So the capsular tear does not extend and an effective vitrectomy can be done. Do note that from the cut IA mode, you move to the IA cut mode to aspirate the cortex with a simple yaw on your machines. When you are using a vitrectomy cutter, try and maximize the cut rate and work on medium to low flow parameters. This will give you through this technique, you are getting an effective cortical and vitreous removal, moving from the a cut IA to the IA cut mode, depending on whether you're dealing with vitreous or cortex. Do note that an infusion has been placed through the pars plana to keep this globe stable. And because there is now no longer a compartmentalization, you can also have an AC maintainer for the same. Again, this is a vertical rip and a 3-piece IOL would be positioned well here. I'd just like to highlight again that please be cautious while putting a 3-piece IOL, either implant it over the iris and then dial it in, or you will have to keep one end dangling out to ensure that though this has vertically dropped, it has still not dropped into the vitreous, because you have access to one haptic which you can latch onto. In fact, it's gone so vertical that we actually, since we have access to pars plana, posteriorly levitate this IOL and put it back into position. Though there is no intact capsulorhexis, 3 clock hours of consistent capsule, good capsular support, 180-degree apart will give you enough space to put this IOL in a stable manner. Now, moving on to the next case, fortunately, in both these cases, you have had only soft cortex to deal with. What would you do if you have a large heminucleus still remaining? You don't have a posterior capsule, so this may drop back into the vitreous, and that is a complication that an anterior segment surgeon can't handle. So this is a technique popularized by Dr. Amar Agarwal, wherein a 3-piece IOL again comes to your rescue, and you put it behind, after levitating the nucleus piece up, you put it behind the nucleus piece so as to give you a life jacket or a lifeboat of an IOL scaffold. Do note that this technique works well for soft cataracts. I would not recommend it for moderate to hard cataracts because you risk endothelial damage to a significant degree. This is just a pictorial representation of how the technique is done. You see that the nucleus has been levitated up into the anterior chamber. The IOL then put behind the nucleus. Again, you can keep one end of the haptic dangling out because you don't know whether you will need to fix this IOL or this IOL will go into the sulcus. Of course, if you have an intact capsulorhexis, this IOL will in all likelihood go into the sulcus and can then be optically captured. Do note that a viscodispersive, a viscode kind of a viscoelastic is really the lifeline for doing such a maneuver in the anterior chamber. Now, this is a femtocataract being done. This is one of the earlier OCTs. The technology has progressed and the OCTs have become better since then. But what you have here is a capsulorhexis being fashioned. When you do have an increased risk of PCR, a capsulorhexis about 5 mm is ideal because it will give you good enough support to put the IOL in the sulcus and even optically capture it. A very large capsulorhexis will make optic capture difficult. Now, what is the problem here is that we've done a hydro maneuver and not decompressed the bag. This bag has already been inflated by the byproduct of femto, which is the gaseous byproduct. You see here that the red reflex has become very prominent. That's so because there is no PC. Now you have no posterior capsule, but you have a large heminucleus. So what we're going to try and do here is to resort to the IOL scaffold technique. The only flip side is that a femto has already segmented and softened this heminucleus, which will cause this to not come out in a single piece, which would be easier had it been the conventional method. But we still bring it up in 2 pieces, which have been segmented through the femto. Once it is in the anterior chamber, the IOL scaffold technique is going to be followed, and the 3-piece IOL will be inserted behind the nucleus pieces. Again, viscoelastic a must. Between the piece and the corneal surface. Once note here, the IOL is still above the iris. Till you've done your complete cleanup and you've really been sure that now you can put the IOL in the sulcus, you will now again dial into the sulcus and you can optically capture this for greater stability since you have a good rhexis. This is the case where the 3-piece IOL has been put where there's been a large capsular extension into a PCR and it decentered. So we again went in and cleared the vitreous, but it did not center again. Such a case where there is inadequate capsular support will require fixation into the sclera. The 3-piece lens lends itself into easily to a glued IOL technique. You see here that the same haptic is captured and externalized to the sclerotomy. which can then be embedded into the sclera through a track created by a needle. In the interest of time, I'll just show you a better video. This is how the externalization works. And then you are simply embedding into the sclera and keeping the flaps back on with glue. Just one last video. Just look at what's happening here. This is a case that had a non-dilating pupil in the other eye or dilating to less than 6 mm. And what we are faced with is a floppy iris. This patient had been taking tamsulosin and the resident had not taken history of that. And this is what you will be faced with. You have the iris prolapsing out. If you're going in on high parameters, this floppy iris can actually get sucked into your port, and that you basically end up with a massacre of the iris. And this has to be avoided at all costs by taking a good preoperative history. Note that if a pupil does not dilate above 7 mm, you will most likely face a floppy iris. You may need to use atropine preoperatively. No point stopping the tamsulosin because the effect usually remains. I personally feel that a good viscomydriasis and use of phenocaine dilates this pupil well and keeps it well in place for the phaco. Use low flow parameters, dilating devices if you feel you're not able to manage the billowing of the iris, and try and minimize the number of times you enter and exit the eye. And you will be able to manage these cases successfully. Another thing that you saw the iris prolapsing in the incision site, for that a hook should ideally be placed in a manner that the iris is pulled away from the site of entry. I don't think I have enough time, but just to show you with low flow parameters, a pre-segmented nucleus, good control of your AC and your maneuvers, just going in once and not doing repeated maneuvers, using viscomydriasis and phenocaine, you're able to stabilize the iris enough to even go in through a small pupil like this and remove all pieces effectively. Of course, for IA, you need to visualize. And for that, you can use a Y hook to really pull back the iris and make sure that the cortical cleanup is complete. So all in all, with improved techniques and instrumentations and technologies, we are now able to handle complications with greater ease and able to face our challenges, grow as surgeons, and give better outcomes to all our patients. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, ma'am. It was quite insightful. Proceeding further, we call up the next speaker for the day, Dr. Namrata Sharma. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. I would be, just one second, I will open my. So I would be actually basically presenting the results of a large study that we've done at RP Center.
I think as ma'am presents her talk, just take this opportunity to, though ma'am doesn't need an introduction, I think she's a qualifier would be, she's one of the most powerful women ophthalmologists in the world and not just in India. And that's a proud moment for all ophthalmologists in the country. And ma'am's always continued to inspire all of us. So thank you, ma'am, in many, many ways.
Thank you so much, Ritika. It has been a pleasure always, Ritika, to interact with you. And I still remember our RPC days.
Yes,
ma'am. Not hold you back because you were at Center for Sight, but you were great surgically.
I would have loved to be held back had it had CFS not been calling.
Yes, yes.
Best time of my life there.
That was our loss, but anyways, you are doing so well.
Thank you.
Congratulations and thank you. I'm going to be talking about intracameral antibiotics for postoperative endophthalmitis. And post-cataract surgery endophthalmitis is one of the most dreaded complication. And although there has been a decrease in incidence from 1 to 0.05 to 0.1% over the last decade, but it still continues to be there. And the incidence ranges from 0.05 to 0.1%. Now, important thing is that it leads to poor visual outcomes, and permanent severe vision loss can occur in about 1/3 of the cases. And there are organisms which are responsible for it. Most commonly, the Coagulase negative staph, Staph aureus, Streptococci, gram-negative bacteria, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, and fungi. And in India, if you see, gram-negative infections are most common, followed by fungal infections. Now, prevention is better than cure, and to prevent endophthalmitis, there are various measures which can be taken, which include preoperative topical antibiotics, povidone iodine installation in conjunctival sac for can be put for 5 minutes, a use of intraoperative intracameral antibiotics and postoperative topical antibiotics as well. And there are various types of antibiotics which can be used, such as fluoroquinolones, aminoglycosides, cephalosporins, or chloramphenicol. And the route of administration could be topical, intraocular, subconjunctival, or oral, and the timing of antibiotics could be pre-op, intra-op, peri-op, and post-op. Preoperatively, I think it goes without saying that you have to start antibiotics at least 1 day before, and the written informed consent should be taken. And during the surgery, one should prevent any leaks that can occur, and topical fluoroquinolones are instilled in the conjunctival sac, as well as intracameral antibiotics. Some people give it to all cases and some give it to complicated cases only. Now, if you look at the role of intracameral antibiotics, it has been studied since long. 2007, 30% of the responders, as per the ASCRS endophthalmitis prophylaxis survey, used intracameral antibiotics, which increased to 50% in 2014. And in 2014 itself, 84% respondents, they said that they will use it if it is an approved formulation. At that time, it was not approved formulation. Now, the rationale for use is that the AC contamination will be less and intraocular bacterial contamination would be much less. And direct intracameral injection of the antibiotic achieves high concentration persisting for longer duration compared to the topical use. Now, there are various antibiotics which have been used: cefuroxime, moxifloxacin, vancomycin, and cefazolin. And cefuroxime is the second generation cephalosporin gram-negative bacteria. Moxifloxacin is the fourth generation fluoroquinolone with gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria. And vancomycin is, of course, for gram-positive bacteria. And cefazolin is the first generation cephalosporin. In the ESCA study, they used cefuroxime, and it was a large multicentric trial which involved 16,603 patients, and there was a 5.8-fold decrease in the rate of culture-positive endophthalmitis, and they strongly supported the intracameral use of cefuroxime. The only problem was that it was not commercially available, and one had to prepare it. So these were the concerns which were there, and also subsequently there was resistance which was seen at least in our Indian data to the gram-negative isolates. Vancomycin is something also which has been used, but the only concern was risk of hemorrhagic occlusive retinal vasculitis. And this is a paper which is demonstrating the same, which has been shown that it can occur. And so people gave up the use of vancomycin. Moxifloxacin, on the other hand, is a fourth generation fluoroquinolone which has dose-dependent bactericidal activity and remains bactericidal for much longer duration than cefuroxime. And has reduced susceptibility to the emergence of bacterial resistance. And this is just to show that the bactericidal levels are maintained for a longer duration of time. So they would be maintained even up to 4 hours at clinically administered doses following the intracameral injection. And in vitro comparative models have also shown that moxifloxacin is the only antibiotic which is active against Pseudomonas aeruginosa. And this is something which is the commonest in our country, and so it has a role to play. Vancomycin and cefuroxime are ineffective against Pseudomonas aeruginosa. Now, these are the studies to show, retrospective studies, all of them non-randomized, to show that intracameral moxifloxacin works. This was done in 1 lakh patients, which showed 4-fold decrease in the endophthalmitis. And this was done in 6 lakh patients, which showed 3.5-fold decrease in MSICS and 6-fold decrease in fecal emulsification. And this is a study from Japan on 15,000 eyes, which showed that there was a 3 times decrease in endophthalmitis. Importantly, this study showed that there were no AC reactions or endothelium compromise, or corneal thickness did not show any change when intracameral moxifloxacin was used. Again, this looked at the safety of the prophylactic intracameral moxifloxacin and was found to be safe with no significant difference in terms of endothelial cell loss, cell counts, or corneal pachymetry, or corneal clarity, or edema. Now, this study again looked at a huge number of eyes, and it showed that it decreases the endophthalmitis rate by 7 times. More importantly, in cases where the rents had occurred, the rate was significantly decreased to 0.18%. Now, we did a survey of All India Ophthalmological Society to understand how our members were using intracameral moxifloxacin, and 4,292 people responded to this survey with a response rate of 30.2%. And we found that it was similar in decision for pre and post-operative antibiotics and intracameral antibiotics. But instead of the intracameral antibiotics, the AIOS members were using more often subconjunctival antibiotic. And I think that really has no role or minimal role. And so we would advocate use of intracameral antibiotics as opposed to subconjunctival antibiotics. And this is just to compare the ASCA survey and the AIOS survey. Notice that this is much less as compared to what the ASCA survey is, and our subconjunctival use is much higher. Now, this study did a meta-analysis between cefuroxime, moxifloxacin, and vancomycin for cataract surgery, and there were 17 studies which were included in this. And they showed that the endophthalmitis rate did decrease, and there was no difference in efficacy between intracameral plus topical antibiotics versus intracameral alone. So from the safety point of view, it should be given because there are no toxicity issues at all. Now, we did this randomized controlled study, which is the first ever, I think, which is there. Even ASCRS had planned to do this study, but could not because of the funding problem. And we are thankful to CIPLA for sponsoring this study, the prospective evaluation of intracameral moxifloxacin for prevention of post-cataract surgery endophthalmitis. The two centers were RP Center for Ophthalmic Sciences and Sadhguru Netra Chikitsalaya, Chitrakoot, and we are thankful to them. So in group 1, we are doing routine phaco followed by intracameral injection of moxifloxacin, and in group 2, we are only doing phacoemulsification. In RP Center, we've recruited 6,000 patients, and in Chitrakoot, they have recruited 1,500 patients. And our objective is to see whether it is effective or not, and also to see the effect on the endothelium. So the mean age of our patients in both the groups, the gender, the type of the cataract is well matched. The preoperative factors, if you see in terms of visual acuity, intraocular pressure, endothelial cell density, central corneal thickness is also matched. And so is also the various other parameters which may affect the outcome in terms of infection post-operatively, that is the incision size, the incision type, the location, the IOL optic, and the IOL haptic. Now, if we look at our results in terms of posterior capsular rupture, also our cohort is well matched. And these are our post-operative results. You see there is hardly any difference between the two groups where moxifloxacin is given and where it is not given. And overall, the number of cases with endophthalmitis was only 1 in each group, and there were no ocular or systemic adverse events seen with intracameral moxifloxacin use as of now. So this is just an interim analysis, and so we conclude from this study and also otherwise also that proper protocols need to be followed for operation theater, patient screening and precautions, operation theater preparation, pre-operative, intraoperative, and post-operative antibiotics. And we do realize that although intracameral moxifloxacin is important tool to prevent endophthalmitis, but cannot substitute for the breach of the protocols that can occur in any of these steps. So these cannot be ignored at all. So we do need to follow protocols and use intracameral moxifloxacin to prevent endophthalmitis and the loss of the eye. So thank you very much for your kind attention. And if there are any questions, I would be happy to take them.
Ma'am, we can proceed with all the question answers in the end of the session. We can now proceed with the next speaker.
Yes.
Thank you, ma'am. So our next speaker for the day is Dr. Manisha Chhabra. Good morning, ma'am. Over to you.
Thank you. Are my slides visible and am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, very much.
At the outset, I want to thank All India Ophthalmology Society and especially Dr. Namrata for giving me this opportunity to present my thoughts on bacterial keratitis management first. So if you look at this 17-year-old male who presented with pain, watering, redness, and diminution of pain since 7 days, we are very clear from the picture of the cornea that this patient is dealing with grave infection of the central part of the cornea with discharge present. There is an overhanging edge. And if you look at this ring-shaped infiltrate, which is there. So how do we go about treating this patient? At presentation, this patient was on cocktail therapy, on antibiotic, antifungal, and even antiviral. So what's most important in such cases is to go in for a microbiological evaluation. We did that in this patient, and within half an hour of the corneal scraping, we came to know that we were dealing with a gram-negative bacteria. We started the treatment for the patient in the form of fortified antibiotics, and within 3 days, we found that the patient had started to respond. After 3 days, we got in the microbiological detailed reports with sensitivity patterns as well. We continued the medications as the patient looked like being sensitive to the antibiotics which we had started. And as the time progressed, by day 9, the patient had become much better and the corneal lesion had healed. And by 2 to 3 weeks, the corneal lesion had scarred almost completely. So what was different? He was already on medications before, and what was different that we did? Basically, it's the corneal scraping which helps. Corneal scraping has to be taken up from the active edge and the floor of the ulcer. The staining techniques being the gram stains will show gram-positive bacteria which will appear blue, negative which will appear red or purple, and you need to observe also the morphology in cocci or rods. This can be done very not I would say easily, but if you are trained enough, an ophthalmologist can pick up these conditions and also at least come to know whether it's a gram-positive or a gram-negative bacteria. Next step is always to go in for culture medias, which help us in identifying which organism or which bacteria we are dealing with. It can be, we have to inoculate in vinegar and chocolate agar, and to rule out fungus on Sabaros, and if we are suspecting acanthamoeba, we must use non-neutral agar seeded with E. coli. Bacterial keratitis can present in any of these forms, which may be a small lesion or a suture infiltrate, large infiltrate, limbus to limbus. Now, the causative organism can be a gram-positive bacteria with an array of organisms being there, or a gram-negative bacteria. Acanthamoeba not coming in bacterial infection must also be considered whenever we are dealing with a very painful condition and central ring infiltrate. Just a brief about the organisms which you can suspect at the time. Whenever it's a post-trauma, sac infection, or a suture abscess, pneumococcus keratitis comes first to the mind. They are also called ulcer serpiginous. They usually have hypopyon associated with them, and melt and perforations are common. So this is one of the suture infiltrates which, when treated well, did respond to the medical management. In compromised corneas, which may be because of a PBK, a herpetic infection, or dry eyes, Staphylococcus keratitis must be considered. It's usually a localized with fairly distinct borders and healthy stroma surrounding it. So this was one of the cases which grew Staphylococcus, and with broad spectrum antibiotics, it did respond well. We are all scared of Pseudomonas keratitis because it has a virulent course with diffuse epithelial graying on stroma, thick mucopurulent exudate, and ring ulcerations with melting. We say that right in front of our eyes, the cornea starts to melt. Sometimes we have very difficult situations, like this was a patient, day 2, post-C3R, and this was around 5 to 6 years back, and post-C3R, the patient did have this sort of a position where there was a starting of an infiltrate, a very round glass appearance of the epithelium, which was not common. We went ahead and did the corneal scraping for the same, and the second day only we found that we were dealing with a gram-negative organism. Started the patient on topical antibiotics, and the patient did respond to the medications and scarred. Sometimes you have this wreath-like pattern, and when you put them on the with the proper staining methods, you can find out that we may be dealing with organism like Nocardia. So, what is actually the clinical microbiological profile, and how do we assess the outcomes of keratitis? So we did this study, we call it as the Delhi Infective Keratitis Study, with an aim to study the clinical microbiological profile of infective keratitis at a tertiary eye care center in North India. It was a retrospective hospital-based cross-sectional study with 1786 corneal microbiological reports identified within 2 years period, and 625 scrapings which had of infective keratitis which fulfilled the inclusion criteria. A microbiological evaluation was done, and demographic profiles, signs, symptoms, risk factors associated, and the outcomes were assessed. Of this, majority of the patients who presented were males as compared to females, and all patients in our study had unilateral involvement. The important part was that the predisposing factor in most of the cases, majority of the cases came out to be trauma, which was followed by previous ocular surgery, which was in the form of a previous keratoplasty or most of the cases of previous keratoplasty, or at some cases even post-trap we had. So if you look at the microbiological profile, we had 24%, that is 150 smear positive for fungus in the mouth, and 303 gram stain positive. Of these gram positive, 62.9% were culture positive, and on the culture positive, we found that majority of them were gram positive, that is 75%, followed by gram negative bacteria. We also had 11 cases of microsporidia in this study. If you look at the details in the bacterial, I'll just stick to the bacterial keratitis. Staphylococcus was the most prominent organism identified in gram-positive, followed by Streptococcus, and in gram-negative, Pseudomonas remains an important organism, which the proportion is now growing up as the years are passing. And the sensitivity pattern is always a matter of concern when it comes to Pseudomonas. Even in our study, we found that it was slowly getting resistant to a lot of standard medications which we've been using for gram-negative bacteria. So when we come to the treatment for these bacterial keratitis, which may present in any of the forms, we should always grade the ulcer, whether it's in the mild variety, a moderate, or severe ulceration, what we are saying. The choice of antibacterial agent always hits the bullseye. Like if we know which organism we are dealing with, we can just go in by the antibiotics, which should be based on the smears without waiting for the results of the culture and the sensitivity. That we can see after some time. Initial empirical therapy based on the smears is frequent instillation of broad spectrum antibiotics, which may be in the form of combination mode of therapy or monotherapy. I still believe that a loading dose, if it is given 5 minutes interval for half an hour and 10 minutes till 1 hour, that is for the next 30 minutes, followed by 1 hourly installation of antibiotic drops, remains a good mode of therapy for these patients. Loading dose definitely helps in sensitizing the patient towards the importance of the drugs, and also gives them a lot of confidence when they are sitting in the clinic and waiting for maybe the checking out of the patient. Combination therapy can be in the form of a gram-positive and a gram-negative fortified medications, being cephalosporin. Now, if it's not available, sometimes ceftazidime and ceftriaxone can also be given. Along with that, a fortified aminoglycosides. In routine cases, I just give fortified tobramycin, but when I feel it's we may be suspecting nocardia or any atypical, fortified amikacin does well. Monotherapy for ulcers which are smaller and confined is a good option, which may be in the form of fluoroquinolones, moxifloxacin, ciprofloxacin. There have been various reports and treatment modalities depending on which fluoroquinolone to be used, but broad spectrum fluoroquinolones does well in small bacterial confined bacterial ulcers. So this was a patient which treated with monotherapy, did well and did heal with a scar. There is no need for systemic antibiotics in smaller ulcers, but the indication definitely comes when it's a perforating ulcer with a scleral involvement, and if we are having infection with a more virulent organism like Neisseria or Haemophilus. Adjunct treatment along with antibiotics should be cycloplegics, analgesic medications if the patient is in a lot of pain, and if we are suspecting or the patient is having secondary glaucoma, we need to treat them with anti-glaucoma drugs as well. So these are some of the dosage of the antibiotics which we give topically, and which we may have to prepare the fortified medications like vancomycin, cefazolin, gentamicin, and tobramycin. With the treatment, the patient, the cornea may scar, which may have very superficial opacity or nebular, macular, and leukomatous opacity, depending on the initial intensity of the bacterial infection. Or the patient may go on a impending perforation level. So if it's perforated, we have to go in for a glue or a penetrating keratoplasty or a tectonic keratoplasty. A glue would do well, like an isobutyl cyanoacrylate glue would do well in any sort of perforated corneal ulcer, which is less than 1 millimeter. Sometimes even up to 2, we are able to take care of it if we put a graft or a multilayered AMG along with the glue. It has well with when the ulcer is debrided. What's most important is that the surface should be dry and deepithelialized. The breakdown product, as we all know of this glue, is formaldehyde, which helps as holding it together. And the end point always remains the vascularization at this area, which is important for it's an indication that a glue can be removed. Sometimes we have this presentation wherein we don't see a lot of infective infiltrate, but it's a melt which is happening with very severe thinning which is present. The patient is already on antibiotics and the thinning continues. So we can go in for adjunct surgical maneuvers like tarsorrhaphy, which helps in preserving the surface. And this is the case 5 days after tarsorrhaphy. And finally, it heals after 3 to 4 weeks with proper medication and taking care of the surface as well. Whenever the ulceration is progressing, there is non-response to therapy, and there are large areas of perforation, therapeutic keratoplasty or tectonic keratoplasty remains the only option for it at our hands, and it does well if the tissue we are taking and the other conditions are good. Corneal button has to be sent for microbiological evaluation, which has to be in the form of cultures as well as histopathology. We always have to consider some pearls in therapeutic keratoplasty, which are in the form that trephination should be large enough and include 1 millimeter of the surrounding cornea. This is one of the cases of Sphingomonas posimobilis, which is basically a very similar organism to Pseudomonas, post-phocoemulsification surgery at a side bone, which was successfully treated with a patch graft, and he did well in this eye. We have to assess the therapy. How do we feel that it's responding? It's basically because of something of perimeter, reduction of density of suppuration, and the areas where we feel that the patient is responding to medications. But if the patient is not responding and it's progressing, we need to admit the patient, review the microbiological results, do corneal biopsy, and suspect any other possible causes.
Ma'am, sorry to interrupt. The time's up. If you could just conclude it in within 1 minute.
It's the last. So we should document, and to conclude, I would just say that make a clinical diagnosis. A proper documentation remains the most important aspect when it's a multi-center place where a lot of surgeons may be seeing after you. And there is an indispensable role of microbiology remains in bacterial keratitis, and be specific in treatment. We do not need to give all the medications which are available. Thank you so much. And thank you again, AIOS, for giving me this opportunity of presenting this forum.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Proceeding further with our next speaker, Dr. T. Nirmal Frederick. Welcome, sir. Over to you.
Yeah. Just give me a moment. Is my slide visible?
Yes, sir.
Right. My voice is clear?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. So I'd like to thank AOS, the organizing committee, and CIPLA for this wonderful opportunity. And my topic is infection control standard during COVID times. One of the positive aspects of Corona is the renewed interest in infection control. And also our people have relatively got better with no spitting, no crowding, no queue, following the queue, hand wash, and washing their feet. So my talk today is basically on these 5 topics: the hospital infection control principles, the protections and various barriers, the training and monitoring of our staff, audit and outcomes, and the triage and certain OPD protocols. And this is based on the IPC protocols and relevant program linkages. So the first part is adhering to the standards. As you know, COVID has evolved over a period of time in the last 15 to 16 months. There have been various guidelines and updates from CDC, the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, ICMR, as well as the state administration. There may be some difference in the guidelines, but it's important that we adhere to the updated standards. And the talk is also based on the national guidelines for infection prevention and control, as well as the other relevant guidelines from the various stakeholders. And accreditation standards have evolved over a period of time, right from minimum requirement to maximum requirements. And as hospital and healthcare providers, it's important that we maintain all these standards in care delivery system. And AOAS has come out with a preferred practice pattern at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. And this is a useful resource to follow for the practitioners. As you all know, infection is one of the most common adverse event in healthcare, and this can be preventable through hospital infection control measures. And the first step is establishing a comprehensive program in your facility and the clinic. So who is at risk? All of us are at risk, particularly the doctors, nurses, and healthcare providers. And how does the infection transmit from patient to workers and worker to patients and worker to worker or the staff? So this is how the infection control standards go, starting with the patient flow, the administrative controls, infection control practices, and engineering controls, manpower, including the staff health and training, and developing their capacity, and also the logistic issue, particularly availability of PPE and other resources, and then the clinical management. So the objective of this program is protecting yourself, your patients, the community, and the environment, and also enhance the ability of the clinic to survive this pandemic and provide care during the COVID pandemic, and also prevent from amplifying the outbreak. So basically, this program has to be documented for medical legal reasons as well as auditing purposes. And this infection control mechanism should be there in all areas of the hospital. The first step is to go about this is customizing your standard operating procedures. So don't copy from other institutions, learn by yourself and modify to your needs, and make the SOP or COVID update based on the standard and reliable references rather than WhatsApp or social media updates. So it's important you update the infection controls SOP every year. And for example, this was updated in the first version 1 in April 2020 and the version 2 in April 2021. And it's important you display and communicate with the local community about the various measures taken to prevent healthcare infections. And this can be in the base of display units or visual alerts and talking walls. The second point is minimizing the chances for exposure, and certain procedures and precautions to be followed in OPD areas. And so first thing is to start with controlling your entry and exit to the clinic. So you need to have a proper flow chart and triage system. And at the entry, you have to screen the patients for a temperature as well as pulse oximeter. Ask them to hand wash and provide hand rub and provide mask. And you also have to be vigilant about proper usage of masks. And the third point is managing the visitor access. You all know in India, visitors form the majority of incoming people into the hospital. So these people have to be controlled during COVID time. And you have to avoid crowding in the waiting areas, and seating arrangement have to be separated with at least 1 meter spacing between the seating areas. And there has to be some physical barrier between the patients if they are waiting for a long time. And limit staff movement, ensure that the windows and doors are open to bring in more fresh air, and ventilation can be changed by putting more exhaust. And during lean time, do not switch off exhaust so that you get fresh air coming into the clean areas. And we ophthalmologists can be the first point of contact, particularly because of the close nature of examinations. So you have to be careful during the lockdown as well as post-lockdown period. Defer all low risk and non-urgent care or do the teleconsult, and see only the patient, and you can teleconsult with the attenders. And ask the patient to wear mask all the time. Routine OP may be restricted during the lockdown, and ensure that emergency services are continued. and routine camps and diabetic screening camps may be postponed. And certain precautions to be taken in the OPD, keep the doors open and ensure there is a barrier between or a protective shield in the slit lamp and all examination equipment. And avoid direct ophthalmoscopy and not dilating fundus camera. IDO can be used. Tonometer can be used with proper precautions. And perimetry, of course, there is a risk because of the closed bowel and a long time of testing, but there is no significant difference in the aerosol count in the bowl of HFA. And so there is a low risk of contamination. You can continue to do all these investigations, but ensure that infection control mechanisms are followed. And beware of this crazy COVID and post-COVID presentations, particularly high incidence of herpes zoster ophthalmicus is a long case series, about almost 18 cases we have seen in the first and second wave. And then non-healing conjunctivitis, non-responding conjunctivitis, episcleritis, and scleritis, they do need oral and topical steroids. And now the epidemic within the pandemic, rhinoorbital cerebral mucormycosis, a rapidly progressive disease. The key to vision and patient survival is early diagnosis. So connecting the dot, a lot of varied atypical presentation in the OPDs, the delayed referral, high risk of infection, and most of these patients may be still be positive. So you have to be careful about implementing the infection control. The standard precautions have evolved over a period of time with every epidemic, and now with COVID update, standard precaution with COVID update have to be followed. And these are all given in the various guidelines as well as patient standard safety standards. Hand hygiene continues to be the gold standard, and PPE has to be optimized and used judiciously because of not only non-availability, but also the problem with biomedical wastage. And you have to see to that all layers are followed in the hospital, right from social distancing, wearing masks, washing hands, RT-PCR testing, as well as now the vaccination. So how safe is eye surgery during COVID time? The elective procedure has to be taken carefully. Emergency patients can be taken. In eye care, the risk is relatively less, but ensure that all surgeries are day care. And if you are taking post-op patients or treating patients who need admission, you have to be careful with the attenders also. So ensure faculty or senior faculty members attend to the patients to reduce emergencies. Try to avoid GA unless mandatory, and preferably topical or local anesthesia. Ensure that all the staff wear appropriate PPE. Engineering controls a major stay in COVID control. High-risk areas have to be properly monitored and surveillance measures initiated, particularly your OP, OT, and the CSSD. And some of the procedures are high-risk procedures like lacrimal surgeries, oculoplastic surgeries, and post-traumatic surgeries. And you can also use these adjuvant measures, the ultraviolet sterilizers, air sterilizers, and ozone sterilizers to reduce the viral load and ensure that UVGA is, people are not exposed to ultraviolet germicidal irradiations. Engineering control, it's mandatory in operation theaters. Ensure there is proper plumbing and no seepage because of the high risk of mucor in the community now. And ensure that AC ducts, filters are all clean, and there has to be proper monitoring of the working areas when it's under repair. The sixth aspect is training and educating our staff. Ensure that the staff stay home if they are sick to prevent infection to the other staff and to the patients. These 5S rule should be applied to all the staff: social distancing, safety PPE, self-hygiene and self-isolation, and of course, self-discipline. And so this is the consent form we give to all the staff, and also we take a checklist questionnaire to ensure that they are free from the symptoms in the initial phase. The seventh point is establishing the reporting procedures. This is mandatory for the safety of the organization and the doctor. COVID-19 is a notifiable disease, and now mucor is also a notifiable disease because of the epidemic nature. Mucor is one infection that has really surprised everyone as fungi or the interface organism between life and death. And these are some of the patients we encountered. So preventing mucor is also part of infection control. Judicious use of systemic steroid has to be inculcated with the physician and the treating team. The diabetes mellitus have to be aggressively monitored and controlled. And in high-risk cases, you can consider primary posaconazole prophylaxis and strict aseptic precaution while administering oxygen. So now the oxygen usage was very high, high flow oxygen, and also the usage of industrial oxygen. So ensure that sterile water for the humidifier, and staff change the humidifier daily. And also the personal and environmental hygiene is taken care of, and barrier mask covering the nose and mouth all the time. So the key for quality patient care and infection containment is hand hygiene, respiratory etiquette, contact and droplet precautions, standard and additional precautions protecting yourself and the staff, triage for OPD and inpatients, and judicious and appropriate usage of PPE, and a good process for disinfection and sterilization of key clinical areas. There is only one good, that is knowledge, and one evil, that is ignorance. I hope I sowed the seed of knowledge in the last 10 minutes or so. Thank you for your patience. I hope the hall coordinator is available.
Probably they are not. So in the interest of time, I'll
Yeah,
go ahead.
yeah, she's there.
Yeah, okay. So hello everyone, I'm Dr. Tarjini Dave. I work at L.V. Prasad Eye Institute, and I'm going to talk to you about mucormycosis, the black fungus, and the battle that we are fighting within this war of COVID-19. I hope I'm clearly audible and my slides are visible. Please show me a thumbs up if
Yes, yes, please go ahead.
Yes, they're visible. Right. Thank you so much. So the objectives of today's talk are to take you through the several aspects related to mucormycosis that you see on the right-hand side of your screen via 10 points that I'm going to talk about. Now, this is one of the most important slides. Why has this become an urgency? The reason is that if you look at the survival rates after mucormycosis, it's about 60%, which means 40% individuals will succumb to the disease. This is a relatively high number, and it's a very fast spreading fungus. Now, move on to the last point on this busy slide, and you understand that those patients who have cerebral involvement from mucormycosis, in those patients, the mortality is actually as high as 80%, which is really high. And hence the urgency in recognizing early as well as initiating treatment early for these patients. The second point is about the fungi which produce mucormycosis. It's not just mucor, but it's the entire order of mucorales, any of these organisms which can actually go ahead and produce mucormycosis. And you'd be able to differentiate these based on microbiological techniques. Now, the burning question of the moment is, why do patients with mucormycosis, with COVID-19, why do they develop mucormycosis? Why are we seeing a sudden increase? And there are several reasons for this. I'll take you through these one after the other. The first one is that the SARS-CoV-2 virus, when it produces COVID-19 infection, breaks down the epithelium within the nasal mucosa, which allows easy access for the spores of mucormycosis to enter and become invasive into the nasal passages. The second part is that COVID-19 infection itself produces dysfunctional macrophages, and macrophages are the first line of defense against any infection in the body. So their dysfunction reduces the innate immunity that a body has to fight external infection, and hence we are more susceptible to developing mucormycosis. The next part is related to the neutrophils. Again, in COVID-19, there is a certain dysregulation in the neutrophils, which are the second line of defense that the body has. And these are especially more in patients who have hyperglycemia. And hence, again, the body's innate immune system is almost made dysfunctional, making it easy for us to develop secondary infections. Those patients with COVID-19 who develop a cytokine storm go through a phase where they have iron overload in the body and they have oxidative stress. Iron by itself is something that Mucor loves and thrives on, and hence there could be an increase in incidence of mucormycosis in patients who develop this cytokine storm. Another reason is reactive oxygen species that are produced during the cytokine storm go and affect the macrophages and make them further dysfunctional, reducing the body's immune mechanisms further to fight any infection. And the last part is that all the other arms of adaptive immunity, such as the natural killer cells or say the platelet factor 4, all of these are affected in COVID infection. And hence your innate as well as adaptive immune mechanisms of the body goes down, and there are substances circulating in the blood such as iron, which Mucor loves, and hence we are seeing more incidence of mucormycosis in patients who have suffered from COVID-19. One another thing that also happens is increase in a receptor known as GRP78 in the respiratory lining in patients who've suffered from COVID. And this receptor is the primary one which internalizes Mucor, takes it into the across the epithelial cells and makes it invasive. And hence again, we are seeing more mucormycosis with COVID. Now, when you're faced with a patient who you are suspecting has mucormycosis, how do you approach these patients? So essentially, these will be patients who would have certain host factors like uncontrolled diabetes mellitus or treatment with steroids during the phase of COVID-19 infection or certain immunomodulators. When you see these host factors coupled with symptoms such as severe facial pain, and this is pain that they'll categorically tell you they've never experienced earlier in their life, or sort of blocked nose, decreased vision, or certain signs such as swelling around the eye, drooping of the eyelid, ophthalmoplegia, CRAO, restricted motility, panophthalmitis, or a frank palatal or nasal eschar, then these are telltale signs of mucormycosis. These patients would require a complete blood workup, especially the metabolic parameters. They would require a nasal swab and micro workup to figure out if this is invasive fungal mucormycosis or not. So essentially, what is the diagnostic pathway? So once you have any suspected or proven mucormycosis, you go ahead with imaging, and then you stage whether this patient has only rhinoorbital disease or rhino-orbitocerebral disease. You get all the sample that you require, and this initially is from the nasal mucosa, to perform microbiology as well as histopathological techniques and figure out whether you are able to grow either Mucor or see the broad fungal hyphae which are non-septate on histopathology. Now, based on all these tests, you can divide mucormycosis into possible, probable, and proven. So when you have your classic host factors that we discussed, diabetic, immunocompromised patient who presents with these signs and symptoms and has COVID infection fairly recently, then you call it as possible mucormycosis. When you have the characteristic signs and symptoms that I just told you, along with a nasal endoscopy or an MRI telling you that this looks like invasive fungal sinusitis, you call it probable. And when you have tissue diagnosis, either with the help of microbiology or histopathology, you call it as proven mucormycosis. Now, imaging, it actually forms the cornerstone of management in patients with mucormycosis. And this is a fungus which shows angioinvasion. So if you look at this gentleman who has ptosis and this little skin ulceration over here, his MRI actually shows you invasion by the fungal hyphae into the superior ophthalmic vein as well as the cavernous sinus. This is classic of mucormycosis. There are several other signs in the paranasal sinus which are very suggestive that the patient might have mucormycosis. And actually the imaging of choice remains an MRI with contrast because it helps you easily delineate the orbital involvement when compared to CT scan and hence pick up early orbital involvement, which is what you want to do. So there are several presentations in the orbit that you might see in the form of just enhancement in the orbit, or this form of weird fat stranding within the orbit, or at times a frank abscess in the medial or inferior orbit. Then again, at times enlargement of your extraocular muscles. However, all of these can still be treated conservatively with injections behind the eye. But if you see this sort of gross intraconal presentation and perineural presentation, then these are the patients that would progress to exenteration. Yet another patient where you see this tenting of the eyeball, look at the shape of the eyeball here and compare it to the other side, and you realize that this tenting is actually because of a gross increase in the intraconal pressure due to an abscess building up intraconally by mucormycosis. CT has a very limited role in mucormycosis and should not be used as one of the diagnostic modalities. You can read up more about imaging in our current paper in IGO. Moving on to management, all the patients with mucormycosis, whether proven or probable or suspected, go ahead with IV amphotericin B, which is initiated in all of these. Along with IV amphotericin B, they also undergo early surgical debridement of the sinuses. The eye management would depend upon how the severity of the eye infection is. And one of the most important things is to reverse their immune deficiency and to bring their glycemic control back so that they are not going into a sort of repetitive infection due to mucor. Now, these kind of patients with massive orbital involvement, there's nothing else that you can do but exenteration to give him a fighting chance to live. But if you have minimal orbital involvement, which is taking up contrast, then it means that the blood vessels there are patent, and whatever systemic amphotericin B you give along with local amphotericin B behind the eye is going to work. And this is a patient in whose case ophthalmoplegia partly reversed, and we did not require to perform an exenteration. So there is very limited literature on the role of transcutaneous retrobulbar amphotericin B in these patients. And if you were to sort of, get a synopsis of all these, then you'd realize that these are the patients in whom vision was preserved. The disease was primarily sino-orbital. There wasn't cerebral involvement, and they had localized orbital tissue with vitality proven on contrast, in which case transcutaneous retrobulbar amphotericin B works. Now, just a little word on IV amphotericin B. Though we've seen an acute shortage of drug, amphotericin B remains the first choice of drug. The deoxycholate form is usually avoided if, and this is primarily because it is nephrotoxic. However, in the absence of drug availability, the deoxycholate form can also be used. The second and third line remain isavuconazole and posaconazole. And typically the treatment continues as an induction treatment for about 1 month, followed by a maintenance treatment, which goes on for about 3 months until we deem the patient stable radiologically as well as clinically, as you can see in this patient who, after completing a 4 to 5 month course of antifungals, is stable and does not have progression. But what after the battle is won? You may still have patients come back to you with these kind of defects in the exenterated socket, which may still require some amount of intervention. And briefly, to end my presentation, I would urge everybody interested in mucormycosis to go through this recent publication of ours, which gives you 6-month outcomes in patients with rhino-orbital cerebral mucormycosis, and also tells you risk factors which are responsible for a poor outcome. So to summarize, I've spoken to you about why there is an urgency involved in treating mucormycosis. What are the fungi that cause it? Why does COVID-19 predispose a patient to mucormycosis? What are the diagnostic pathways? Why does MRI stay the imaging modality of choice? In brief, discuss the management paradigm with you, cases where we go ahead with exenteration and cases where we are a little conservative and try to do debridements with transcutaneous retrobulbar amphotericin B. We spoke about the alternate drugs, and we also spoke briefly about the challenges that may lie ahead after we've won this battle. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, ma'am. If we have any questions, we can come up with them. All the attendees are requested, if they have any questions, they can put down in the Q&A tab. Meanwhile, if the panelists want to have any discussion, any comments on any others' presentations or.
I think wonderful talk, Dr. Tarjini. I just have one question now. What is the status of amphotericin availability now in Hyderabad?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Acharya. I enjoyed your top one corneal infections. Currently, in many parts of India, as you would be aware, amphotericin underwent, drastic change in availability, in the sense that it was government regulated and patients had to secure it from the government. It still remains to be so, but we have a lot of pharma companies that have chipped in and have increased their production of amphotericin B. It's a very labile molecule, and hence production itself is time consuming. So currently, yes, amphotericin B is available. The colloidal form is more freely available than the liposomal formulation of amphotericin B. But yes, it is available.
What's the difference, in your experience, on the efficacy of the colloidal and the other form?
Would be a little early to say that. Liposomal amphotericin B, we've studied it for a very long period of time and is the absolute gold standard. But it's only through this pandemic that we will all learn over a 6-month period to understand what happened. But just, eyeballing the data that we have, not particularly the colloidal form, but posaconazole and isavuconazole are definitely suboptimal to amphotericin B in their efficacy. So there was a period where none of the amphotericin Bs were available and all our patients were completely on posaconazole. And in that period, we definitely did see a lot of worsening of disease. Patients required more debridements, early exenterations to sort of reduce the disease load.
I think great effort, but by the data which you are collecting and what the publications you've made, I think they've really added a lot to our understanding of mucormycosis. So congratulations of handling so many patients. Yesterday, I was talking to somebody, they were saying 45 patients admitted in the medical college and amphotericin not available. And being a government setup, it's very frustrating. They were saying, we don't know what to do now to continue admitting and all. So I think on and all, the pan-India condition is very variable. I wouldn't say the same standards being followed in every state.
Yeah, and there are certain things which are very weird. The numbers in India are just exponential. And though we are the diabetic capital and we've discussed so much on mucor, but at times you wonder that why is it that you're seeing so much load of mucor? Is it just the steroids which are being used for these patients, or there are multiple other factors in our microbiome which puts us into the high risk category for developing mucor? Probably only time will tell.
We have a question from our audience. What is the role of topical eye drops in mucormyosis?
Topical penetration of amphotericin B is not very good, and hence we sort of resort to not drops but injections of amphotericin B. These injections are typically given in the quadrant of involvement. So if you say, for example, have a medial orbital abscess, then you're going to go either inferomedial or superomedial with a long 1 to 1.5 inch needle and try and inject it into the abscess. Versus that, say you have an apical involvement, then you'd want to go and target the apex. And again, if you have intraconal involvement, it's typically a case that requires exenteration. But then still, if you want to consider eye salvage, if there's good contrast uptake, then you'd go retrobulbar and inject amphotericin B. I hope that answers the question.
Ma'am, I think that was it for the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Shweta, for conducting the session for all of us. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Shweta. And thank you, everyone, for this session.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.